Hello, today we'll be recapping the 2015 Norwegian movie, The Wave, which is based on a true story. The film opens and we see real footage of a disaster that occurred in 1905 in Norway. A large rock slide took place and formed a 40-meter-high wave that hit land while the town was asleep. It killed 63 people, and many years later another tsunami hit which caused 40 more deaths. The narrator says there are over 300 unstable mountainsides in Norway, and it is only a matter of time until the next disaster. We flash to the present day. And now a town named Geiranger is under that very threat. A nearby mountainside called Akernes is currently unstable and will eventually send 7 million cubic meters of rock into the water below. This will likely cause a tsunami of immeasurable size. We then meet Christian, a geologist who drives onto a large ferry boat which takes him over to town. He arrives at home and greets his 2 children, and his wife Idun, who is fixing a leaking pipe. He gives her a kiss and tells her their new home won't have these problems. But Idun jokes, saying their new home won't have a soul. At dinner, Christian talks about their new apartment and the advanced technology it has, such as locking and unlocking the front door with an app. After dinner, the family continues to pack for their move, and Christian notes with his new home comes a new job and a new life. He has some last-minute worries, but Idun comforts him, saying it is already decided. The next day, Christian heads into the early warning center for his last day of work before the move. Inside, they monitor the mountains for any landslides or warnings, and today everything looks normal. He shares a cake with his co-workers as a goodbye, and they congratulate him on his new job. As Christian packs his office and prepares to leave, he hears beeping from the control room. Inside, he learns that water levels have shrunk several feet in 2 sectors, and underwater cameras were disconnected. The team looks at the mountainside camera, and everything looks stable, but Christian imagines the worst. He's worried, but his co-worker snaps him out of it and tells him everything's fine and he can keep packing. Back at the house, Christian monitors the numbers as the family packs, and Idun asks what's wrong. He tells her something strange happened to the water levels today, but she brushes it off, saying his job is done now. He reluctantly agrees and gets up to assist the family. As he takes out the trash, he notices his son Sander sitting near the water. He asks what is wrong, and his son tells him he doesn't want to move. Christian comforts him, but Sander asks what happens after some years in their new town, Stavanger. Will they just move again when Christian finds another job? Sander walks away sad, and Christian is left wondering how his career choices are affecting his children. Before the family leaves, they say goodbye to their neighbors who talk about the move. As they talk, Idun mentions that Christian and the kids will be taking the ferry ahead of her as she has a few days of work left. During the conversation, Christian looks up at the mountains and can't shake the feeling that something is very wrong. Later, Christian drives him and the kids to the ferry port. As he waits in the car, he watches as Sander plays a Jenga game and all the pieces come crashing down. He then looks over at the rocks and notices a stream of water dripping from them. He stops for a moment deep in thought, but the cars behind them honk for them to move. Christian then quickly turns the car around and races off to the early warning center. He tells his children to wait here and he runs inside. He enters the building and tells the workers he needs to show them something, his voice now grave. Meanwhile, Idun rides her bike to the Hotel Geiranger, which she works at. The hotel only sits 1.7 meters above sea level. As she begins to check in some tourists, she tells her co-worker that her family is already on the ferry. Back in the warning center, Christian tells the team he thinks the water sensors have been damaged due to shifting in the rock layers. The rocks could soon collapse, and without the sensors they will not be able to give a warning to the town. The team is a bit skeptical, but they know they need to investigate and head out on helicopters to visit the sensors. They fly over the massive mountains and land at the Eagle Nest control station 870 meters above sea level. Christian and one of his co-workers quickly get out and get equipped with climbing gear. At the hotel, Idun receives a call from Sander and is informed that her family actually hasn't left yet. On the mountain, Christian rappels down into a crevice where their equipment is set up, and he turns on his camera so the rest of the team can see. Him and the man split up to check sensors 4 and 5, and they both begin to pull out the wiring. To their shock, they pull the wires up and both men realize their sensors have been completely severed. In the control stations, the remaining workers watch with grim looks on their faces. Back in the warning center, Christian explains that the wires were not cut by natural movements, and the others agree that something is definitely going on. The team throws out some suggestions to conduct more tests, but Christian questions if they've lost their minds. He shows them a simulation of what will happen if those rocks fall and says an 80-meter wave would decimate the town in only 10 minutes. After some arguing on whether to hit the panic button, the team ultimately decides to go on yellow alert. This means crews will monitor the mountain around the clock and watch the numbers. Christian finally apologizes for being so quick to panic over torn wires, and he seems sure they will take care of the situation. He returns to his car and sees a note saying his children left to visit their mom. He arrives at the hotel and finds Idun glaring at him, quietly scolding him for visiting work with the kids in the car. He apologizes and tells her he has a really bad feeling, and they make plans to leave the town tomorrow. Sander wants to spend the night at the hotel, so Christian returns home with his daughter, Julia. Back at the house, he sets up a chair and mattress for him and Julia. That night, he drinks some liquor from his colleagues and sits in his chair, watching the mountains from out the window. He texts Aidan and apologizes again, and she just smiles thinking about him. Then, to be safe, she takes out an evacuation plan for tsunamis and flips through the different routes. Night falls and the small town grows quiet. At the hotel, Sander gets bored and heads to the basement of the hotel to ride his skateboard. As he skates, he puts on his headphones and blasts some music. Back at the base, one of the workers notices some flashing number and runs to wake up the others. In the house, Christian suddenly awakes after having dozed off for a bit. At the Eagle Nest, Arvid and Jacob are woken up by a radio and told that the large crevice has suddenly contracted. They think it is impossible, and they radio that they will personally go into the crevice to check the sensors. Christian then goes out onto his porch and stares out at the mountains. The two workers begin to rappel into the crevice, and the others watch through the cameras. Christian calls the control center feeling something is off, and Margit breaks the news that the crevice seems to be contracting. She tells him Jacob and Arvid have gone down and are checking it out. She will keep Christian posted, but he hangs up and begins to think of the worst. Inside the crevice, some rocks begin to fall around Jacob and Arvid. At the same time, the control center begins to flash and seismic activity is being recorded at large levels. Christian heads to his dumpster to look for his old work papers, but suddenly he hears something. He looks into the sky and sees a huge flock of birds squealing and flying away from the mountains. He knows this is a very bad sign and runs inside with his papers. He calls the warning center and asks if Jacob and Arvid are still in the crevice. The worker says yes, and Christian yells to put them through on the phone. Christian tells them to drop whatever they are doing and get out of there right now. They are hesitant, but he tells them that the rocks did the same exact thing before the other two major rock slides. They finally listen and begin to leave, but the rocks begin to shake violently and one falls on Jacob's leg. Arvid tries to get him loose, and at the same time the water begins to sink to dangerous levels and the sensors are destroyed. As Arvid helps Jacob, the entire crevice begins to crush inward towards them. Then, all other control sensors go to a code red situation. Christian then tells Margot to push the red alarm button, and Arvid screams in agreement, desperately yelling to sound the alarm. She lifts open the hatch and pushes the button. The sirens begin to sound through the entire town and lights begin to flick on in all the houses. Aidan hears the alarm and runs outside. Back in the crevice, the rock slide momentarily stops and Arvid can finally reach Jacob. Arvid hears the rocks shifting around them. Then he calmly unclips himself and clips his line to Jacob. Jacob asks him what the heck he is doing, and Arvid says it won't hold us both. Then, the entire mountainside begins to slide and Arvid is knocked off and falls to his death. Jacob screams his name as he realizes he just sacrificed his life for him. The massive avalanche of rocks then begins to splash into the water below. The force causes an absolutely massive wave to begin to form at the base. Each second it grows larger, and back at the control center a countdown begins to the computer. The town of Geiranger has only 10 minutes until it is completely destroyed by the tsunami. At the house, Christian loses connection with Margit. Julia wakes up and the entire house shakes as he holds her. The hotel also begins to shake and Aidan realizes that Christian was right this whole time. Christian sets his watch for 10 minutes and Aidan warns her co-worker, Vivek, that the wave will be here soon. Aidan knocks on every door to warn the guests. And Vivek runs off to find the bus driver. After getting all the guests out of their rooms, Aidan calls Christian and asks if they are safe. As he drives, Christian screams at some families to stop packing and leave right now to the hills. He then tells Aidan he is coming to the hotel, but she makes him promise to leave and take Julia to safety. In the hills, the massive wave makes its way to Geiranger. It grows as it travels and smacks the mountainsides, creating loud bangs and destroying everything in its path. In the chaos of the hotel lobby, Aidan suddenly realizes that Sander is missing and races down the hall. Christian continues up the hill but runs into a traffic jam. He looks at his watch and realizes they won't make it like this. So he and Julia get up and begin to run up the hill. He warns the others as he runs, and soon a large group is sprinting up behind him. In the hotel, Aidan cannot find Sander anywhere. As everyone boards the bus, she runs back into the doors despite Vivek telling her she won't make it. Another couple sees what is happening and also runs inside to help find her son. As Christian charges up the hill, he checks his watch and sees they are still not high enough. He picks up Julia in his arms and tries to run faster. But he passes his neighbors, Anna and Tom. He tells them to get out and they start to run, but Anna gets her leg trapped between two cars. Suddenly, a large rumble is heard and the wave appears in the distance. Christian tells Thomas to take Julia and run to higher ground. Then he moves the car that pinned Anna's leg. He grabs her and runs up the hill, but her injury has left her with a limp and she can barely move as the wave approaches. He knows they won't make it, so he throws her in a car and gets in on the other side. He tells Anna to buckle up, and as the wave reaches the car, the two hold hands. The water breaks through the back window and submerges them underwater, and they are violently shaken by the current. They look through the windshield and suddenly a large piece of debris crashes into them. Back at the hotel, Aiden and the couple find Sander in the basement. They race back to the lobby but see that the bus has left without them. They see the massive wave about to reach them, and Aiden suddenly remembers there is a bomb shelter in the hotel. As they run back, Maria freezes in shock and Aiden has to grab her by the arm and they barely make it through the doors. The water rushes in behind them and follows them through the hallway, and Sander and Philip scream at them to hurry. The girls are swept off their feet and Aiden reaches the bunker, but Maria is dragged away by the water. Philip calls for his wife, but Aiden tells him that she's gone and if he doesn't shut the bomb shelter door, they will all die. Aiden and Sander force the door closed and find themselves in a half-submerged room. The light inside sparks out and they are left in darkness. Back on the hill, Christian wakes up and finds himself upside down in the car. He looks over at Anna and takes her pulse, but sadly she has died. He manages to unfasten his seatbelt and he climbs out of the car. He looks around him and tries to process what he is seeing. But it is complete wreckage and there seems to be no survivors in his area. Christian calls out for Julia, then begins to climb the hill. Back at the warning center, Margaret and George monitor the situation and we see the timer has hit 0. Suddenly, Jacob calls in from the eagle's nest and reveals he is okay. They ask if Arvid made it, but he breaks down in tears and the others realize what has happened. As Christian comes across a group of survivors up the hill, he hears Julia and she runs into his arms and they embrace. Christian sees his neighbor Thomas, and he sees that Christian is alone, meaning one thing: his wife Anna didn't make it. Christine hears a man talking on the phone to some survivors on the Geiranger Mountains, and he asks them if a tourist bus made it out. They tell him one bus did not make it and he fears the worst, but he decides to go down and investigate for himself. Christian tells Julia to stay with Thomas and he heads down the hill into town. In the bomb shelter, Aiden finds the emergency power and switches it on. They try to open the door to escape, but the weight of the water holds it closed and more water pours into the room. They have no choice but to keep it closed or the whole shelter will flood. Aiden finds a vent above them and takes a look, but it is too narrow to crawl through. Suddenly, they hear cracking and water begins to seep through the bomb doors. Philip and Aiden try to use their coats to stop the flow and Philip begins to become unstable, screaming they are all going to die. Aiden tries to calm him down and tells them once the water fills the room they will try to open the door again because the pressure will be lower. Christian rows into town on a piece of wood and sees fire, destruction and bodies all around him. He gets to shore and travels by foot and witnesses the carnage up close. He calls out for survivors, but there are no responses. He continues walking but steps on something that begins to crack. Christian wipes away some mud and finds the glass window of the tour bus. He looks inside to check for survivors, but everyone from the hotel is dead, including Vive. He enters the bus and searches for Aiden and Sander but realizes they must not have been on it. In the distance he sees the hotel. Outside the bomb shelter, the hallway is completely full of water, and inside the room is almost full too. The three now try to open the door again, but struggle because there is now some debris blocking it on the other side. With little air left, they all go to the vent where they can continue to breathe. Philip begins to panic, dragging Aiden and Sander under the water, yelling he won't die like this. Philip continues to dunk them both, and in fear for the life of her son, Aiden drags Philip underwater and proceeds to lock his head between her legs, trapping him. As she is forced to drown Philip, Aiden tells her son not to look. Philip drowns moments later. Christian enters the hotel and finds the lobby destroyed. He calls for his family but gets no response, and he looks in the basement but it is fully flooded. He searches the hallways, and later comes across Sander's room where he finds his bag. He now thinks his family has been killed in the wave and begins to cry. In his anger, he grabs a metal pipe and begins to bang the wall. In the shelter, Aiden hears the noise and they scream for help and also bang on pipes. Christian hears this and realizes someone is alive and he races out of the room. But water begins to fill the vent in the shelter, giving Sander and Aiden very little time. Christian takes a deep breath, dives into the water and sees the bomb shelter. He notices the debris and moves it off the door. Aiden makes one last attempt for the door as Christian works outside, and she finally gets it open and sees her husband. They embrace underwater and Christian motions for her to swim to safety while he gets Sander. She makes it to the steps and Christian finds Sander in the vent. He tells him they need to take one last swim, but Sander is beginning to panic. Christian tells him he has no choice and needs to be strong for his mother and sister. They swim out with Christian leading and pass the body of Philip. In the hallway, the water shifts and Sander begins to panic and drown. Christian goes back to his son and breathes air into his mouth, telling him to go. Sander reaches the staircase, but as Christian tries to swim too, he has the same problem and runs out of air and begins to drown. Sander tells his mother that Christian is still underwater and she dives back in and manages to pull him out. They lay him down and Iden performs CPR, but it seems to have no effect. She becomes more and more frantic, but stops after a few minutes thinking he has passed away. Sander refuses to give up though, and he does more chest compressions and screams at his father to wake up. At last, Christian spits up water and begins to breathe, and the family has a teary embrace in the hallway. Back on the hill, Julia plays with her bunny, trying to give her comfort. A helicopter arrives with a survivor, but it is not her family and she thinks they are gone. As the helicopter leaves though, we see Christian, Sander, and Iden walking up the hill together. Julia happily races up to her mother who holds her in her arms. They all hug and hold each other, grateful to be alive and safe with each other. They walk up the hill through the survivors and the rescue workers, and the film comes to a close. In the post-credits, we learn that the actual Akerns crevice is being continuously monitored in real life. It is still expanding though, and all experts believe there will be another major rock slide. However, no one knows when it will occur.